The Johnsons were 3 hours into their drive across the Navajo Nation when Sarah noticed something in the side mirror. The sun had just dipped below the mesa, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson when she saw it. A figure, running parallel to their SUV along the empty highway. At first, she thought it was a coyote. The way it moved, low and swift, through the brush. But then it cleared a section of bare ground, and her breath caught in her throat. It was running on 2 legs. Running at 70 miles per hour. Her husband Mark saw it next, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. The thing kept pace with them effortlessly, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. Just matching their speed exactly, staying just at the edge of the headlight's reach. When Mark pressed the accelerator to 80, it accelerated too. The movement wasn't human. It was too fluid, too fast, biomechanically wrong in ways that made Sarah's hindbrain scream danger. In the back seat, their 10-year-old daughter Emma had gone completely silent, her face pressed against the window, watching. Sarah turned to tell her to look away, but the words died in her throat. Because now she could see what her daughter was staring at. The figure had turned its head toward them while still running at impossible speed. Its eyes reflected the SUV's lights like an animal's would. But the face, what little they could make out in the dying light, was wrong. Too long. Features that seemed to shift and blur, even as they tried to focus on them. Then it smiled. Sarah will spend the rest of her life trying to forget that smile. Too many teeth. A predator's grin that was somehow worse because it was aimed at them with clear, terrible intelligence. Mark floored it. The speedometer climbed past 90. The thing kept pace, now angling closer to the vehicle, close enough that they could hear something over the engine's roar. A sound that might have been breathing. Or laughter. That's when Emma started screaming about the handprint on her window. A print on the outside glass, fingers too long, appearing as if something had reached out and touched the moving vehicle. But nothing had touched the car. The figure was still 20 feet away, loping along in the darkness. The chase lasted another 4 miles before the creature simply wasn't there anymore. It didn't fall behind or veer off. It vanished between one heartbeat and the next, leaving the Johnson family alone on a dark highway with their terror and a handprint on the glass that the police would later photograph but never explain. What the Johnsons didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that encounter was just the beginning. Because when a skinwalker singles you out, when it marks you for the hunt, it doesn't end with a single sighting on a lonely road. That was an announcement, a declaration of intent. The real horror was only starting. You need to understand something right now. Skinwalkers are not passive folklore. They're not campfire tales meant to give you a safe thrill before you return to your comfortable life. According to the Navajo people who live in the shadow of this terror, these entities hunt actively, deliberately, and they choose their prey with purpose. There are 6 warning signs that you've been marked. 6 indicators that something has noticed you, followed you, and decided that you're going to be next. The Johnsons experienced 3 of them that night on the highway. They didn't know what they meant. They didn't understand the language of the hunt being spoken around them. Most people don't. And that ignorance, that inability to read the signs, is exactly what makes the hunting so effective. By the time you realize what's happening, it may already be too late to do anything but run. And these things are so much faster than you are. This isn't entertainment. This is a survival guide disguised as a documentary. Because whether you believe in skinwalkers or not, there are people vanishing in the desert. Real people with families and futures, gone without explanation. The Navajo Nation has areas where locals simply will not go after dark. Places where something hunts. Where the old warnings are still whispered, still obeyed by those who know better. In the next chapters, we're going to explore each of those 6 warning signs in detail. We're going to tell you exactly what to watch for, what it means when you see it, and what you should do if it happens to you. We're going to share stories from those who survived encounters and those who investigated the disappearances of people who didn't. But more than that, we're going to try to answer the questions that keep researchers and witnesses awake at night. What are these things? What do they want? And why, after centuries of warnings, do they still hunt? If you're driving through the Southwest and something starts running alongside your vehicle at impossible speeds, you need to know what that means. You need to know what comes next. Because the Johnsons were lucky. They escaped with nothing more than nightmares and a handprint that faded from the glass after 3 days, but never faded from their memories. Others haven't been so fortunate, and the desert keeps its secrets buried deep. There are subjects in this world that carry a weight so heavy, even speaking their names aloud feels like transgression. Among the Navajo people, few topics demand more reverence, more silence, more carefully guarded words than the truth about Yi naaldlooshii. The phrase itself translates directly to he who walks on all fours. But this simple description fails to capture the full horror of what these beings truly represent. They are not cryptids lurking in unexplored wilderness. They are not monsters born from nature's cruelty or supernatural intervention. They are human beings who have chosen to abandon their humanity through acts so terrible that most cultures lack words to describe them adequately. Understanding the Skinwalker requires first understanding what they are not. Western audiences, hungry for paranormal explanations and creature features, have twisted the concept into something almost palatable, something that fits neatly into horror movie categories alongside werewolves and vampires. This domestication of the truth serves only to obscure the genuine darkness at the heart of Navajo witchcraft traditions. A skinwalker is not cursed. They are not victims of circumstance or tragic fate. They are practitioners of the darkest magic imaginable, individuals who have deliberately walked a path that requires the destruction of everything sacred in Navajo culture. The journey to becoming Yi naaldlooshii begins with a choice that most human beings could never contemplate. Traditional Navajo understanding holds that these practitioners must first master the intricacies of witchcraft, learning ceremonies and rituals that invert and pervert the healing ways taught to medicine people. Where a hatalii, a traditional healer, learns to restore balance and harmony, the aspiring skinwalker learns to shatter it. They study the corruption of sacred songs, the twisting of prayers into curses, the transformation of protective rituals into weapons of spiritual warfare. But knowledge alone does not grant transformation. The final step, the act that severs their connection to humanity and grants them their terrible powers, requires a transgression so profound that many Navajo people will not speak of it even in the vaguest terms. According to those willing to discuss such matters at all, the would-be skinwalker must commit murder. Not just any murder, but the killing of a close blood relative, often a sibling or parent. Some accounts specify that this must be the person the candidate loves most in the world. The act must be personal, intimate, and carried out with full knowledge of what is being destroyed. This is not a crime of passion or accident. It is calculated spiritual suicide, the conscious decision to place power above every bond that makes us human. This requirement reveals the essential truth about skinwalkers that separates them from the monsters of folklore. They are not transformed against their will. They choose this path with open eyes, understanding fully what they sacrifice and what they gain. The murder of a loved one serves as both a test and a binding ritual, demonstrating absolute commitment to a path that the Navajo people recognize as the ultimate evil. In a culture that places family and clan relationships at the center of identity and spiritual health, this act represents the complete inversion of everything sacred. Once this terrible threshold has been crossed, the witch gains abilities that blur the line between human and animal. They acquire the power to don the pelts of animals, coyotes and wolves most commonly, but also bears, foxes, and birds. When they wear these skins, they do not simply disguise themselves. They take on the physical form and capabilities of the creature, moving with animal speed and strength, while retaining their human intelligence and malicious intent. This combination creates something far more dangerous than either human or animal alone could ever be. Imagine encountering a predator in the darkness that moves with the silent efficiency of a wolf, but thinks with human cunning. It does not attack with simple animal hunger or territorial instinct. It stalks with purpose, with planning, with the capacity to anticipate your reactions and exploit your weaknesses. Traditional predators follow patterns born from instinct. Skinwalkers break these patterns because they possess knowledge that no natural animal could have. They understand human psychology. They know how to inspire terror beyond simple fear of death. They can mimic voices of loved ones, calling from the darkness in tones that make you question your own sanity. The Navajo people speak of skinwalkers moving at impossible speeds, keeping pace with vehicles traveling at highway speeds, running alongside cars in the desert darkness, with faces pressed against windows. Witnesses describe eyes that reflect light like an animal's, but contain expressions of intelligence and malice that no beast could project. These accounts emphasize a particular kind of violation, the sense that something fundamentally wrong is looking at you, something that should not exist wearing a shape that mocks natural order. But physical danger represents only part of the threat skinwalkers pose. In Navajo tradition, these witches command powers that extend far beyond shapeshifting. They can cast corpse powder, the ground bones of the dead, to inflict terrible sicknesses. They can perform ceremonies that cause crops to fail, livestock to die, children to waste away with mysterious illnesses that resist all treatment. They operate through fear and corruption, targeting not just individuals but entire families, turning prosperity into poverty and health into suffering. The cultural prohibition against discussing skinwalkers with outsiders stems from multiple concerns, each layer revealing deeper truths about how the Navajo people understand spiritual danger. First and most practically, speaking about these witches is believed to draw their attention. Words have power in Navajo cosmology, and naming something, discussing it, even thinking about it too intently creates a connection that can be exploited. To speak of skinwalkers is to invite their interest, to potentially mark yourself or your family as a target. Second, the very existence of skinwalkers represents a kind of cultural shame, a dark mirror reflecting the potential for evil that exists within the community itself. These are not outside threats, not foreign monsters invading from elsewhere. They are Navajo people who have chosen to betray everything their culture holds sacred. Discussing them with outsiders feels like exposing a family secret, acknowledging a wound that many would prefer to keep private. Third, experience has taught many Navajo people that outsiders cannot or will not understand the genuine nature of what they face. Non-Navajo people approach the subject as folklore, as entertainment, as material for scary stories around campfires. They lack the cultural context to grasp the spiritual dimensions of the threat. Worse, their skepticism and trivializing attitude can feel like a form of disrespect, reducing genuine danger and real suffering to the stuff of fantasy novels and horror film. Those Navajo people who do speak about skinwalkers, usually in carefully controlled contexts with appropriate spiritual protections in place, emphasize that these beings hunt humans specifically and deliberately. Unlike natural predators that may occasionally attack people when other prey is scarce, or when defending territory, skinwalkers seek out human victims as their primary targets. They are motivated not by hunger, but by malice, by the desire to spread suffering and chaos. The intelligence they retain from their human origins makes them uniquely capable hunters. They can plan ambushes, study their victims' routines, and exploit knowledge of human nature to maximum effect. A skinwalker might appear at a remote homestead in the form of a lost traveler, using human speech and mannerisms to gain entry before revealing its true nature. It might mimic the voice of a child calling for help in the darkness, drawing rescuers into isolated areas. It might stalk someone for days or weeks, appearing and disappearing to build psychological terror before making its final move. This predatory intelligence combines with animal capabilities to devastating effect. Skinwalkers possess strength beyond normal human limits, speed that makes escape nearly impossible, and senses sharp enough to track victims across vast distances. They can see in complete darkness, follow scent trails days old, and hear whispered conversations from impossible distances. Yet they also understand locks and doors, know how to cut phone lines and disable vehicles, and can anticipate when potential victims might seek help. The forbidden nature of the transformation itself carries significance that extends beyond the mere mechanics of putting on an animal skin. In Navajo worldview, everything possesses sacred order, a proper place and purpose within the cosmos. Animals occupy their sphere, humans occupy theirs, and spiritual beings occupy yet another. The skinwalker violates these boundaries, mixing categories that should remain separate, creating a hybrid existence that represents fundamental disorder in the universe. This cosmological violation explains why skinwalkers are believed to be so dangerous. They do not simply threaten individual lives. They threaten the very fabric of reality as Navajo culture understands it. Their existence is proof that order can be shattered, that sacred boundaries can be crossed, that chaos can be deliberately introduced into a universe that should function according to harmony and balance. Fighting against skinwalkers, therefore, becomes not just self-defense, but a defense of reality itself, an effort to restore proper order in the face of willful corruption. The gravity of even speaking about these matters reflects an understanding that knowledge itself can be dangerous, that some truths carry risks simply through acknowledgement. In sharing these details, even in general terms that avoid specific ceremonial knowledge, there exists an element of transgression. The Navajo people who maintain traditional ways understand that the world operates according to principles that modern scientific materialism fails to recognize, that words and thoughts have tangible effects, and that discretion in spiritual matters represents not superstition, but wisdom earned through generations of experience with forces that most human beings never encounter. The morning air hung cold and still over Monument Valley on the 11th of March, 2019, when Ranger Daniel Carswell began his routine patrol of the northern access roads. He had worked these lands for nearly 8 years, moving through the towering sandstone formations with the easy familiarity of someone who knew every turn, every vista point, every hidden wash where tourists might get themselves stuck. What he encountered that morning would shake that familiarity to its core and leave him questioning everything he thought he understood about the natural world. Carswell was driving slowly along the maintenance road near Sentinel Mesa when something made him stop. Not a sound exactly, but rather the absence of sound. The complete silence that settled over the desert felt wrong somehow, like the landscape itself was holding its breath. He turned off his engine and stepped out of the vehicle, scanning the rust-colored cliffs and scattered juniper trees that dotted the valley floor. That was when he saw it. Roughly 30 feet away, perched impossibly high in the twisted branches of a dead cottonwood tree, sat the largest wolf he had ever seen. The animal was positioned at least 15 feet off the ground, sitting upright on a branch that seemed far too thin to support its weight, yet the wood did not bend or creak. The wolf's fur was thick and dark, almost black in the early light, and its body was massive, easily exceeding any wolf he had seen in wildlife documentaries or field guides. But what froze Carswell in place was not the animal's size or its impossible perch. It was the eyes. The wolf was staring directly at him with eyes that caught the morning sun and reflected something deeply, disturbingly wrong. They were not the yellow or amber of a normal wolf. They held an awareness, an intelligence that felt distinctly human. The animal did not flinch when their eyes met. It did not show the wariness that any wild creature should display when confronted by a human. Instead, it simply sat there, watching him with what Carswell later described as calculated interest, the way a scientist might observe a specimen or a predator might assess potential prey. For nearly 2 full minutes, neither moved. Carswell felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the prickle of cold sweat forming despite the desert chill. Every instinct screamed at him that something was fundamentally wrong with what he was seeing. Wolves do not climb trees. They certainly do not climb to heights that would challenge a mountain lion or a bear. They do not sit on branches with the balance of a bird of prey. And they absolutely do not lock eyes with humans and hold that gaze with unwavering, penetrating focus. When Carswell finally managed to move, reaching slowly for the radio clipped to his belt, the wolf tilted its head slightly, the gesture eerily human in its curiosity. The ranger fumbled with the radio, never breaking eye contact, feeling somehow that looking away might trigger something he was not prepared to face. Before he could raise the radio to speak, the wolf stood on the branch with fluid grace, turned away from him, and simply stepped off into the air. Carswell ran forward, certain he would find the animal on the ground, injured or dead from the fall. When he reached the base of the tree, there was nothing. No prints in the soft sand. No disturbance in the dried grass. No sign that anything had been there at all, except for the deep claw marks gouged into the branch where the wolf had been sitting, fresh wood exposed and gleaming pale against the weathered bark. He reported the incident to his supervisor that afternoon, his hands still shaking as he filled out the encounter form. His supervisor, a Navajo woman who had grown up on the reservation adjacent to the park, listened to his story with an expression that grew increasingly grave. When he finished, she asked him one question. Had the animal appeared in a place where it had no logical reason to be? He confirmed that it had. She then told him something that made his blood run cold. She told him he had been marked, that he had been studied, and that he should perform a protection ceremony as soon as possible. What Carswell experienced fits a pattern that has been reported across the Four Corners region for generations, particularly in areas sacred to the Navajo people. Animals appearing in impossible locations. Creatures showing up where no natural animal would venture, exhibiting behavior that defies not just logic, but the fundamental laws of nature itself. A wolf in a tree is not simply unusual. It is impossible. Wolves lack the physical adaptations for climbing. Their body structure, their claw configuration, their weight distribution, all of these factors make such an act beyond their capability. Yet witnesses report these occurrences again and again, and the details remain consistent across decades of accounts. In suburban Phoenix during the summer of 2017, a family called police after a coyote appeared on their second-story balcony, its face pressed against the sliding glass door, peering into their living room. The father, a man named Robert Tillman, described how the animal's eyes seemed to track each family member individually, how it showed no fear when he approached the glass, and how it seemed to smile before leaping from the balcony and vanishing into the night. When animal control arrived 20 minutes later, they found no trace of the coyote, but they did find scratches on the balcony railing that were too large and too deep to have come from any canine they were familiar with. A security guard in Flagstaff reported seeing a deer standing fully upright on its hind legs in an empty parking garage at 3 in the morning in October of 2018. The deer, he claimed, was not rearing up in alarm or standing briefly as deer sometimes do when reaching for high branches. It was standing motionless in a completely bipedal stance, its front hooves hanging loosely at its sides, its head turned at an unnatural angle to watch him as he made his rounds. The guard, a former Marine who had served 2 tours overseas, left his post immediately and never returned to the job. In his resignation letter, he wrote only that he knew the difference between an animal and something pretending to be an animal. These accounts share common elements that separate them from ordinary wildlife encounters. The animals appear in locations that make no environmental sense. Coyotes do not scale vertical walls to reach second-story balconies. Deer do not loiter in enclosed concrete structures with no vegetation. Wolves do not perch in trees like ravens. The locations themselves seem chosen specifically to maximize the wrongness of the encounter, to create a sense of displacement and unreality that lodges deep in the witness's mind. Beyond location, the behavior of these creatures consistently violates natural animal instinct. Wild animals avoid human contact. They flee when confronted. They show fear, aggression, or wariness, but they do not study. They do not observe with calm, measuring intelligence. They do not make eye contact and hold it with purpose and intent. Yet, in these encounters, the animals do exactly that. They watch. They assess. They demonstrate an awareness that feels profoundly other, something wearing an animal shape, but animated by a consciousness that is distinctly not animal. According to traditional Navajo beliefs, skinwalkers often scout their intended victims in animal form before making their move. They choose shapes that allow them to approach unseen, to move through areas where a human would be noticed and questioned. But they also choose forms that allow them to reach places no human could access easily, to peer into windows, to appear on rooftops, to observe from positions of advantage. The appearance in an impossible location serves multiple purposes. It allows reconnaissance while simultaneously generating fear and confusion in the target. Those who study folklore and anomalous phenomena point to something deeper in these encounters, something that taps into primal human fear. We evolved alongside predators. Our ancestors survived by learning to read animal behavior, to distinguish between a deer that might flee and a lion that might attack. That ability to instantly assess threat based on behavioral cues is hardwired into our nervous system. When we encounter an animal that violates those ancient patterns, when a creature looks at us with intelligence that should not be there, our deepest instincts sound alarms that operate below conscious thought. This is the instinctual dread that witnesses describe, the feeling that something is wrong at a level they cannot articulate. It is not merely fear of physical harm. It is the horror of category violation, of encountering something that breaks the fundamental rules by which we navigate reality. The human brain cannot easily process a wolf in a tree, a coyote on a balcony, a deer standing upright in concrete dark. These images create cognitive dissonance that manifests as visceral unease, as the crawling sensation of wrongness that lingers long after the encounter ends. Daniel Carswell eventually transferred to a different park system, moving more than 500 miles away from Monument Valley. In the 3 years following his encounter, he reported feeling watched during his patrols, seeing shadows that moved against the wind, hearing footsteps that matched his own pace through empty wilderness. Whether these experiences were psychological aftereffects or something more sinister, he could not say. What he knew with certainty was that the wolf in the tree had truly seen him in a way that suggested recognition and purpose. He had been marked by something that understood him far better than he understood it. The question that haunts these accounts is not whether the witnesses saw what they claimed to have seen. The consistency of details across time and distance, the credibility of many witnesses, and the genuine trauma evident in their testimonies all suggest real experiences. The question is what exactly they encountered, and more troubling still, why these things choose to reveal themselves in ways specifically designed to unsettle and disturb. When animals appear where they should not be, when they behave in ways that violate nature, we are forced to consider possibilities that our rational minds resist. We are confronted with the notion that intelligence can inhabit forms we assumed were limited, that consciousness might transfer or transform in ways our science does not acknowledge. The impossible locations are not accidents. They are announcements. They are demonstrations of power and presence. They are messages written in the language of dread, telling us that the world contains more than we have allowed ourselves to believe, and that some of what it contains is watching us with eyes that understand far more than eyes like those should. The high desert night settled over Shiprock, New Mexico, like a heavy blanket in the spring of 2016. Maria Begay had just finished washing the dinner dishes when she heard it. Her daughter's voice, clear as a bell ringing through the darkness outside their home, calling for help. The voice was urgent, frightened. It called out, "Mama, please. Mama, help me." Maria's hands were still wet from the dishwater when she rushed toward the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every maternal instinct in her body screamed at her to get outside, to reach her child, to protect her daughter from whatever danger lurked in the darkness beyond their home. Her hand was on the doorknob, already beginning to turn it, when something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the voice echoed across the empty land. Perhaps it was some ancient warning passed down through generations of her people that suddenly surfaced in her consciousness. Whatever the reason, Maria stopped. She called out, asking where her daughter was, asking what was wrong. The voice responded immediately, telling her to come outside, to hurry, repeating, "Please, Mama, I need you." But the words felt hollow somehow, like they were being pushed through the wrong kind of throat. Maria turned away from the door and walked down the short hallway to her daughter's bedroom. Her hands were shaking as she pushed open the door. There, in the dim glow of a nightlight, lay her 8-year-old daughter, sound asleep, breathing peacefully under her blankets, completely safe and unaware of the terror gripping her mother's chest. The voice outside continued calling. It grew more insistent, more desperate. It begged and pleaded with a mother's worst fears given sound. Maria stood frozen in her daughter's doorway, looking back toward the front of the house where that voice, that perfect imitation of her child's voice, continued to cry out from the darkness. She forced herself to move back toward the front door, this time approaching the window beside it instead. The porch light was on, casting a weak yellow circle across the wooden planks and the dirt yard beyond. Maria pressed her face close to the glass, careful to stay back from the window itself, and she looked out into the night. The voice had gone quiet now, but something was moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. She could see it crouched there in the shadows, something that was the wrong shape, the wrong size. It shifted its weight from side to side with a movement that was almost human, but not quite, like someone had learned to move by watching people, but had never actually been one. The thing stayed just out of the light, as if it knew exactly where the boundary of illumination ended and the protective darkness began. Maria backed away from the window. She locked the door, checked every window in the house, and then she sat in her daughter's room until the sun came up. She never opened that door. She never went outside to investigate. And she says to this day that this choice, this decision to trust her instincts over her ears, saved both their lives. The ability of skinwalkers to mimic human voices is perhaps their most terrifying weapon. Unlike other creatures of legend that rely on physical prowess or supernatural strength, skinwalkers understand something fundamental about human nature. They know that we are hardwired to respond to the voices of those we love. When a mother hears her child crying, when a husband hears his wife calling for help, when a son hears his father's voice raised in alarm, every fiber of our being compels us to respond, to help, to protect. The Navajo people have known about this particular danger for generations. Elders warn children never to respond to voices calling from outside after dark, no matter how familiar they sound. They teach that a skinwalker can steal a voice just as it steals a skin, wearing it like a mask to deceive and manipulate. The stories passed down through families all carry the same warning. Verify before you trust, look before you leap, and never ever open your door to a voice in the darkness, no matter whose voice it might be. Thomas Nez, a ranger who has worked in the Four Corners region for over 30 years, recalls an incident from 2009. A family reported that they had heard their grandfather calling to them from outside their home near Kayenta. The grandfather's voice asked to be let in, said he had fallen and hurt himself, needed help getting up the porch steps. The voice sounded exactly right, had the same gentle tone the old man always used, even included his characteristic slight stutter on certain words. But the grandfather was inside the house. He was sitting in his chair by the fireplace, reading a newspaper, exactly where he had been all evening. When the family told him what they had heard, he nodded slowly, unsurprised. He told them his own voice had been stolen twice before in his lifetime. He said the trick was knowing that the real person would never ask you to put yourself in danger, would never insist you come out into the darkness alone. The family stayed inside that night, and they heard the voice continue calling for nearly 2 hours. Thomas says that when he investigated the property the next morning, he found tracks in the soft earth around the house. They started as human footprints, but as they circled the building, they gradually changed, becoming something else, something with claws and a different gait. The tracks approached each window, each door, as if the thing making them had been testing for weaknesses, looking for any opening that might grant it entry. Sarah Yellowhorse, a school teacher in Shiprock, describes her own encounter with voice mimicry from 2014. She heard her brother's voice calling to her from outside her classroom window one evening as she worked late grading papers. The voice said her name over and over, told her he needed her to come outside, that there had been an accident, that he needed her help right away. But Sarah's brother lived in Albuquerque more than 3 hours away. There was no reason he would be standing outside her classroom at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She called his cell phone, and he answered from his apartment, confused about why she was calling, asking if everything was okay. Sarah told him to stay on the line with her while she looked out the window. What she saw still haunts her. There was a figure standing beneath the window, visible only as a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the night sky. When she directed her phone's flashlight toward it, the figure moved with inhuman speed, dropping to all fours and racing away across the school grounds, faster than any person could run. Sarah says the worst part was that even knowing what it was, even seeing it run away in that horrible loping gait, the voice had sounded exactly like her brother. Every inflection had been perfect, every familiar turn of phrase. What makes these encounters particularly disturbing is the subtle wrongness that witnesses often describe. The voices are perfect imitations, exact copies of loved ones, and yet something about them feels off. Multiple witnesses describe the same characteristics. The mimicked voices often sound too flat, lacking the full emotional range of genuine human speech. They repeat phrases in exactly the same way, like a recording being played over and over, rather than a real person speaking naturally. Victims also report that the voices seem to come from the wrong direction, or from multiple places at once. A voice that should be coming from ground level might seem to emanate from higher up, or it might move from place to place too quickly, appearing to jump from one location to another without the speaker actually moving. Some witnesses describe the voice as having a hollow quality, as if it were being projected through a tunnel or filtered through something that strips away its humanity. The persistence of these voices is another common thread in the accounts. A real person calling for help would pause, would wait for a response, would perhaps try a different approach if they receive no answer. But the mimicked voices continue calling, repeating the same phrases, maintaining the same tone and urgency for hours at a time. It is this mechanical persistence, this inhuman patience that often alerts potential victims that something is wrong. The threshold itself seems to hold special significance in these encounters. Skinwalker lore consistently emphasizes the importance of doorways and the boundary between inside and outside. There appears to be a rule, or perhaps a limitation, that prevents these creatures from entering a home uninvited. They can approach the door, they can call and plead and demand, but they cannot cross that threshold unless someone opens the way for them. This is why the voice mimicry is so crucial to their hunting strategy. They need someone to open the door, to step outside, to cross from the protected space of the home into the vulnerable darkness beyond. Once a person has left the safety of their house, once they have moved beyond that threshold, they are in the creature's domain, subject to its rules, exposed to its full power. Dr. Jennifer Blackwater, an anthropologist who has studied Navajo folklore for over 20 years, suggests that this threshold symbolism reflects deeper cultural values about home, safety, and community. The Navajo concept of hajo, which represents harmony and balance, is strongly associated with the home and family. The home is a protected space, a place of order and safety in a chaotic world. To violate that space, to trick someone into leaving it, represents a fundamental disruption of that harmony. The voice mimicry attacks the very foundations of trust and family bonds. It weaponizes love, turning a parent's need to protect their child or a child's desire to help their parent into a trap. This psychological warfare is perhaps more terrifying than any physical threat because it undermines our most basic instincts, making us question our own senses, our own judgment, our own hearts. Maria Begay's story from 2016 serves as a powerful reminder of this danger. In the years since that night, she has shared her experience with others in her community, emphasizing the importance of verification, of trusting intuition, of understanding that not everything that sounds real actually is real. Her daughter is now a teenager and knows the story well. Maria has taught her that if she ever hears her mother's voice calling from outside, she should never respond, never go to investigate, never open the door until she has physically seen her mother inside the house. The tradition of storytelling in Navajo culture serves not just to entertain, but to educate, to pass down crucial survival information, wrapped in narrative form. The stories of skinwalkers and their voice mimicry are warnings, lessons about the dangers that exist in the world, and the importance of maintaining boundaries, both physical and spiritual. They teach that safety lies in community, in staying within the protected spaces we create, in not venturing alone into the darkness, no matter what we think we hear calling us forward. The sound began just after midnight on a cold February evening in 2018. The Martinez family, longtime residents of Kayenta, Arizona, were settling into sleep when they first heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching against the bedroom window, not the frantic scrabbling of a tree branch in the wind, not the random tapping of a confused bird. This was methodical, purposeful. 3 long scrapes down the glass, followed by silence, then 3 more. Rachel Martinez sat up in bed, her hand instinctively reaching for her husband's arm. Thomas was already awake, his eyes fixed on the window where the curtains hung motionless in the still air. The scratching came again, and this time they both noticed something that made Rachel's breath catch in her throat. The sound was moving, not across the window but up and down it, as if whatever made it was traveling vertically along the glass with impossible ease. The window itself was 15 feet off the ground. Their bedroom sat on the 2nd floor of their home, a modern construction built into a hillside with no trees close enough to touch the walls, no structures nearby that could provide access to that height. Nothing should have been there. Thomas rose from the bed slowly, his movements careful and quiet, as if sudden motion might provoke whatever clung to the other side of that window. He approached in the darkness, not wanting to turn on the lights, not wanting to see and be seen. The scratching stopped. For nearly a minute, there was only silence, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He was 3 feet from the window when the sound erupted again, so sudden and so loud that he stumbled backward. This time, it wasn't a scratch. It was a long, dragging scrape, like fingernails or claws being drawn slowly down the entire length of the glass from top to bottom. Whatever was out there knew exactly where he stood. They didn't sleep that night. They sat together in their bed, backs against the headboard, watching the window as the scratching continued intermittently until dawn. Sometimes it would stop for 20 minutes, long enough for them to begin relaxing, to wonder if perhaps it had been their imagination after all. Then it would resume with renewed intensity, as if their momentary peace had been the entire point of the silence, as if something was teaching them that relief was temporary, that there would be no real rest. When morning finally came, Thomas went outside to examine the wall beneath their bedroom window. He expected to find something, some explanation that would make sense of the night's terror. What he found instead deepened the mystery into something far worse. The stucco wall showed no marks. No scratches, no scuff marks, no indication that anything had climbed or clung to its surface. The ground below was hard-packed desert soil that showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. He looked up at the window, measuring the distance with his eyes. 15 feet, at minimum. The nearest roof edge was 20 feet away horizontally. There was simply no way for anything to reach that window without leaving some trace of its presence. That second night, they prepared. Thomas loaded his rifle and set it beside the bed. Rachel called her mother, who lived 2 hours away in Chinlo, and told her what was happening. The conversation was difficult. Her mother belonged to a generation that didn't speak openly about such things. But Rachel heard the sharp intake of breath when she described the scratching at an impossible height. Her mother's voice became very quiet, very serious. She told Rachel to burn cedar, to keep the lights on, to not look directly at the window when the scratching came. And then she said something that terrified Rachel more than the scratching itself. She said, "Do not let it know you are afraid. That is what it wants. Your fear is food, and once it has tasted enough, it will want more than fear." The scratching began earlier on the second night, just after 10 in the evening. This time it started on the wall adjacent to the window, moving along the exterior of the house at that same impossible height. Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, yanking back the curtains with sudden defiance. He needed to see it, needed to confront whatever was out there. The motion sensor light they had installed that afternoon blazed to life, flooding the side of the house with harsh white illumination. There was nothing there. The wall was empty, but the scratching continued, now on the opposite wall, the one facing away from the motion sensor's range. He ran to the other side of the room, to the window that looked out in that direction. Again, nothing visible. Again, the sound moved, returning to the original window behind him. It was playing with them. The realization settled over Thomas like ice water. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal confused by its reflection or defending territory. This was intelligent. This was deliberate. Whatever clung to the walls of their home in the darkness was demonstrating that it could move faster than they could respond, that it could avoid their sight while remaining audibly present, that their attempts to see it or stop it were futile, and perhaps even amusing to it. Rachel had burned cedar as her mother instructed, and the smoke filled the bedroom with its sharp, clean scent. For a brief time after she lit it, the scratching stopped entirely. They sat in the smoke-hazed room, hoping that perhaps the old remedy had worked, that whatever tormented them had been driven away by this traditional protection. Then the scratching resumed on the window directly above where the cedar smoldered. Louder now, more aggressive. Long, violent scrapes that sounded like they should be tearing through the glass itself, though when Thomas shone his flashlight on the pane, it remained pristine and unmarked. The psychological toll of that second night was worse than the first. The entity, if that's what it was, seemed to be learning them. When Rachel would begin to calm down, when her breathing would slow and her grip on Thomas's hand would loosen, the scratching would surge. When Thomas would start to convince himself that they were overreacting, that there must be a rational explanation, the sounds would shift to a new location, demonstrating mobility and awareness that no rational explanation could encompass. They were being studied. Their reactions were being cataloged. Someone or something was mapping their fear. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas made a decision born of desperation and rage. He would go outside. He would take his rifle and his flashlight, and he would circle the house while Rachel watched from the window. When the scratching started, she would signal him, and he would run to that location and finally see what haunted them. Rachel begged him not to go. The thought of being alone in the house while that thing moved along its walls was unbearable, but so was another night of helpless terror. Thomas kissed her forehead and headed downstairs. She watched from the bedroom window as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness below. He made his way around the house slowly, the rifle held ready. For several minutes, there was no sound at all. The night was perfectly still. Then the scratching came, not on the bedroom window, but on the window of the guest room at the opposite end of the hallway. Rachel ran to it, looked out, and saw Thomas far below, his back to that side of the house, sweeping his light across the empty desert. She banged on the window to get his attention. The scratching stopped instantly. Thomas turned and ran toward the house, toward the wall below where she stood. She watched him arrive and point his flashlight upward, illuminating the stucco surface. Empty. Nothing there. But when his light moved away, when he began to walk back around to the front of the house, the scratching began again on the original bedroom window behind her. Thomas came back inside defeated. Whatever was out there could move silently and swiftly enough to stay ahead of him, to remain always just out of sight, always positioned wherever he was not. It was faster than him, more patient than him. It owned the darkness outside their home in a way he never could. The third night broke them. They had not slept in over 48 hours. Thomas had stopped going to work. Rachel had pulled their 2 children from school and sent them to stay with her mother, unwilling to expose them to whatever was happening. The scratching began at sunset, earlier than before, and it brought something new. Tapping. Rhythmic tapping on the glass that almost sounded like knocking, like something requesting entry with mockery of human politeness. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Scrape dat tot. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Scrape, dot ka. The sounds began to move in patterns around the house, starting at their bedroom window, then moving to the guest room, then to the bathroom window, then back to the bedroom. A circuit, a patrol. And with each passing hour, the sounds grew bolder. The scraping became harder, more violent. The tapping became pounding. It no longer seemed to care about being subtle or mysterious. It was asserting dominance, claiming territory, announcing ownership. At 11:30 that night, Rachel began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place beyond exhaustion. Thomas held her and felt his own resolve crumbling. They could not endure another night. Their mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Every sound made them flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. They were becoming paranoid, fractured, broken. And that, they began to understand, was the entire point. Her mother's words echoed in Rachel's mind. Your fear is food. This was not a simple haunting. This was not a random encounter. This was a siege. A calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to reduce them to a state of complete vulnerability. The thing outside their windows was not trying to get in. Not yet. It was preparing them, weakening them, making sure that when it finally decided to escalate, they would be too shattered to resist effectively. At 1 a.m. on that third night, Thomas called his uncle, a man who still practiced the traditional ways, who knew things that Thomas's generation had largely forgotten. The conversation was brief. His uncle listened, asked 3 questions about the nature of the sounds and their timing, then told Thomas to leave the house immediately. Not in the morning. Not after packing. Now, only. Take only what they could carry and drive away without looking back at the house. His uncle's exact words were, "It has marked you. It has tasted your fear for 3 nights. That is the pattern, divine way. Tonight, it will try to feed fully. You need to break the pattern by leaving. Go somewhere public. Somewhere with many people and many lights. Do not return to that house for at least 4 days. You and now are." They left within 20 minutes. As they loaded their truck in the driveway, the scratching followed them along the outside of the house, tracking their movement from room to room as they gathered belongings. When they finally pulled away, Rachel looked back once, despite her uncle's warning. In the glow of their motion sensor lights, she saw nothing on the walls. But every single window of their home showed scratches on the glass, long vertical marks that caught the light. Marks that had not been there when they were inside looking out. They stayed with friends in Flagstaff for 5 days. When they returned, the scratching never resumed. But the marks on the windows remained, impossible to clean or explain. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, Rachel still wakes to the sound of methodical scraping, only to realize it is just the memory, just the echo of those 3 nights when something tested their boundaries and found them breakable. The silence of the forest should have been their first warning. It was late October of 2020 when 3 experienced hunters set out on the Ute Reservation in northeastern Utah, tracking what they believed to be a mature bull elk. The men, 2 brothers from Roosevelt and their longtime friend, had hunted these mountains for over 2 decades. They knew the land, knew the patterns of game animals, and most importantly, they knew how to read tracks. What they found that day would challenge everything they understood about the natural world, and leave them questioning whether they had truly been the ones doing the hunting. The morning started ordinarily enough. Fresh snow had fallen the night before, creating perfect tracking conditions. Around 8:30 in the morning, they picked up the trail of what appeared to be a large elk, its hoofprints deep and well-defined in the powder. The stride pattern was consistent, the animal moving at a casual pace through the pines. They followed for nearly an hour, the tracks leading them deeper into a remote section of the reservation, far from any maintained trails or roads. Then, at approximately 9:45, everything changed. The lead hunter stopped so abruptly that his brother nearly collided with him. He was staring down at the snow, his face drained of color. The elk tracks they had been following for the past hour simply ended. Not disappeared, not obscured, but ended. And in their place, continuing in the exact same stride pattern and direction, were human footprints. Bare human footprints in snow that measured 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The prints were not beside the elk tracks or overlapping them. They did not indicate that someone had stepped into the trail. Instead, the hoofprints transformed, mid-stride, into the impressions of bare human feet. The right rear hoof of the elk became a right human foot. The left rear hoof became a left human foot. The front hooves vanished entirely, suggesting a transition from 4-legged to 2-legged locomotion. The hunters stood in stunned silence, trying to rationalize what they were seeing. The eldest brother, a man with 28 years of tracking experience, knelt down to examine the prints more closely. The human footprints were large, approximately size 11 or 12, with clear definition of toes, heel, and arch. They pressed deep into the snow, indicating significant weight. But what disturbed him most was the temperature consideration. In weather cold enough to keep the snow powdery and fresh, bare feet would suffer severe frostbite within minutes. Yet these prints showed no signs of stumbling, no indication of distress, no blood or tissue damage that would inevitably occur. He signaled for his companions to remain still as he studied the transition point. There was no disturbance in the snow or around the change. No indication that the creature had stopped. No scuff marks, no area where something had sat down to remove shoes. The transformation had occurred while the being was in motion, between one step and the next. They made the decision to continue following the tracks, though later they would all admit they couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was disbelief, a need to find some rational explanation. Perhaps it was the hunter's instinct to pursue. Or perhaps, as they would come to suspect, they were being drawn forward by something that wanted them to follow. The human footprints continued for approximately 200 yards through increasingly dense forest. The gait remained steady, purposeful. At several points the tracks approached trees and seemed to pause, as if the being was examining something or looking back along its trail. Then, as impossibly as they had appeared, the human prints transformed again. But they did not change back into elk hooves. Instead, at the base of a lightning-struck pine, the bare human footprints became the paw prints of a large canine. Not dog tracks, the hunters noted, but something more substantial. The prints suggested an animal weighing well over 100 pounds, with a stride length that exceeded any wolf they had encountered. The front paw prints measured nearly 5 inches across. This second transformation shattered any remaining rational explanations they had been clinging to. A person might conceivably fake footprints in snow though the lack of any boarding tracks made even that unlikely. But to transition seamlessly from human feet to animal paws, while maintaining a continuous trail with no disturbance in the surrounding snow, was beyond any hoax. The youngest of the three hunters, the friend who had joined the brothers, later reported that this was the moment he felt they were being watched. The forest had grown quieter, he said. No bird calls, no wind through the branches, just the sound of their own breathing and the soft crunch of their boots in the snow. They followed the canine tracks for another 300 yards. The path began to curve, arcing gradually to the east, then to the southeast. The brothers were experienced enough to recognize the pattern. The tracks were beginning to circle. At a small clearing where the snow lay unmarked and pristine, they stopped to check their GPS and get their bearings. What they discovered made their blood run cold. The circling tracks were looping back toward their original position. More precisely, the tracks were circling back to the point where they had first encountered the transformation from elk to human prints, and beyond that, toward the location where they had first picked up the elk trail that morning. The creature, whatever it was circling around to get behind them. The realization hit all three men simultaneously. They were no longer the hunters. The dynamic had shifted, perhaps from the very beginning. The elk trail had been too perfect, too easy to follow. They had been lured into the deep forest, away from roads and other hunters, drawn along by a being that could change its form at will. They made the decision to leave immediately, but not to backtrack along the path they had come. Instead, they struck out directly west, toward the nearest logging road, a route that would take them through difficult terrain but would avoid following the creature's circular trail. As they moved, they noticed something that made their situation even more dire. Fresh tracks, the same large canine prints, were now visible to their north. Parallel tracks, pacing them. Whatever this thing was, it was aware of their change in direction and was adjusting its hunt accordingly. The three men abandoned any pretense of quiet hunting protocol and moved as quickly as the terrain allowed. At one point, crashing through a dense thicket of scrub oak, the eldest brother glanced back and saw something moving through the trees behind them. He described it as low to the ground but fast, moving with a fluidity that seemed wrong somehow, as if its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. They reached the logging road at approximately 11:30 in the morning, nearly 2 hours after first encountering the transforming tracks. Their truck was still 3 miles south along the road, but the open ground gave them sight lines and a clear path. They ran. Later, after they had driven off the reservation and sat in a diner in Roosevelt, trying to process what had happened, they made the decision to report what they had seen. Not to local law enforcement, who they feared would dismiss them, but to a Ute elder the brothers knew from previous hunts on the reservation. His reaction told them everything they needed to know. He didn't ask questions about what they thought they had seen. He didn't suggest alternative explanations. Instead, he asked them a single question. Had they noticed any tracks near their homes in recent weeks? Any animal prints in unusual places? Any signs of something watching their houses? The youngest hunter, the friend, went pale. He had noticed tracks in his backyard 2 days earlier. Coyote prints, he had assumed, circling his house in the early morning snow, stopping at each window. The elder explained what trackers and hunters on the reservation have known for generations. The transforming tracks are evidence of a skinwalker caught in the act of changing between forms. The transformation is not instantaneous, despite what stories might suggest. It takes time, concentration, and when the being is moving quickly or focusing on prey, the change can be incomplete, leaving physical evidence of the transition. Finding such tracks is rare because skinwalkers usually maintain a single form during a hunt. Multiple transformations suggest either a young, inexperienced skinwalker still learning control, or a particularly powerful one that delights in displaying its abilities. More disturbing was the elder's explanation of the circling behavior. When a skinwalker decides to hunt a human, it engages in a stalking pattern that can last days or weeks. It will appear as different animals, testing its prey's awareness, gauging their fear response, watching their pattern. The tracks around the younger hunter's home were not random animal activity. They were reconnaissance. A tracker from the Navajo Nation, who spoke on condition of anonymity, confirmed that transforming tracks are among the most feared signs in indigenous communities across the Southwest. He has personally documented 3 separate cases of tracks that change mid-stride, including one from 2016, where deer tracks became human, and another from 2018, where dog prints transformed into what appeared to be bear tracks, though the size and spacing were inconsistent with any known bear species. The physical evidence is impossible to replicate convincingly, he explained. Hoaxers who have attempted to create fake, transforming tracks invariably leave signs of their deception. Disturbances in the surrounding snow or soil, boarding prints, inconsistent depth, unnatural spacing. Real transforming tracks maintain perfect continuity. The stride pattern flows seamlessly from one form to the next, as if the change is simply a different expression of the same movement. He also confirmed the elder's warning about circling tracks near homes. In his experience, when transforming tracks are found in residential areas, especially tracks that circle a dwelling or stop at windows, it indicates active stalking behavior. The being is no longer observing from a distance, but has selected a specific target and is preparing to act. The three hunters never returned to that section of the reservation. The youngest moved away from Roosevelt entirely 6 months later, though he never explicitly stated why. The brothers still hunt, but only in pairs, never alone, and never in areas where the forest grows too quiet. Their photographs of the tracks, taken on their phones before they fled, show exactly what they describe. Elk hooves becoming human feet becoming canine paws. The images have been analyzed by wildlife biologists and tracking experts. None can provide a natural explanation. The prints are too clear, too consistent, too impossible to dismiss as misidentification or environmental anomaly. The tracks remain documented and unexplained. Physical proof that something walks the boundary between human and animal, between hunter and hunted, leaving its signature in the snow for those unfortunate enough to follow. The smell arrived first, as it almost always does. That's what the witnesses remember most clearly about the evening of September 23, 2017, near Window Rock, Arizona. Not the shape that came later, not the strange way it moved through the crowd, but the smell, an overpowering wave of decay that seemed to physically press against them, forcing its way into their nostrils and down their throats before they ever laid eyes on what was bringing it. Marcus Benally was tending the fire at a family gathering when the stench first reached him. He describes it as hitting him like a wall, so sudden and intense that he actually staggered backward. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was wrong. He'd grown up on the reservation, had helped his grandfather with livestock his entire childhood, had encountered dead animals in various stages of decomposition in the desert heat. This was something different, something that made his stomach clench and his skin prickle with a fear he couldn't immediately name. The smell, he said later, was like roadkill that had been rotting in the summer sun for weeks, but mixed with something chemical, something burning. Sulfur maybe, or the acrid smell of singed hair. And underneath it all, a wet animal smell, like a dog that had been soaked in stagnant water and left to mildew. But the worst part, the detail that made his voice shake when he described it months afterward, was how the smell seemed to carry intention. It didn't just drift on the wind. It moved with purpose, sweeping through the gathering like an invisible scout, preparing them for what was coming. Within seconds, others noticed it too. Sarah Yazzie, who had been helping set out food, felt the nausea hit her so suddenly that she barely made it away from the tables before she vomited. She wasn't the only one. 3 other people at the gathering experienced immediate physical revulsion, their bodies reacting to the smell before their conscious minds could even process what they were experiencing. This wasn't the gradual realization that something smells bad. This was an instantaneous, visceral response that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely and trigger something much older, something wired deep into the survival centers of the brain. James Sosi, a Marine Corps veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, described the feeling as identical to the hypervigilance he'd experienced in combat zones. His heart rate spiked, his hands began to sweat, and he found himself scanning the darkness beyond the firelight with an intensity he hadn't felt since leaving the service. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him that a predator was nearby, that he was in immediate danger. And still, at that point, he hadn't seen anything. The smell alone had triggered a full fight-or-flight response so powerful that his combat training kicked in automatically, Then it appeared at the edge of the firelight, low to the ground, moving between the parked vehicles with a gait that everyone present agreed was profoundly disturbing. At first glance, it looked like a large dog, perhaps a German shepherd or a Malamute. But the proportions were wrong. The back legs seemed too long, the shoulders too high, and the way it moved, slinking between shadows with an almost liquid fluidity, didn't match any natural canine movement pattern. But more than its appearance, more than the wrongness of its shape, was the intensification of that horrific smell. As the creature moved closer to the gathering, the stench became almost unbearable. Multiple witnesses describe it as moving in waves, getting stronger and weaker, as if they were experiencing the olfactory equivalent of a heartbeat. Several people grabbed children and moved toward vehicles. Others froze, unable to move, their bodies locked in place by a fear so primal and overwhelming that conscious decision-making seemed impossible. One woman began reciting prayers in Navajo, her voice shaking but steady, trying to put words between herself and whatever was approaching. The creature moved through the outer edge of the gathering, never approaching the fire directly but circling, its head lowered, and according to every witness, it never made a sound. No panting, no footfalls, no rustle of movement through the dry grass. Just that terrible smell, so thick now that people described it as almost visible, like a miasma hanging in the air around the thing. Marcus Benelli, still by the fire, watched as it paused near a pickup truck, and he swears that in the reflected firelight, its eyes caught the glow and reflected back not the typical green or yellow of canine eyeshine, but a dull, reddish gleam that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though witnesses' estimates of the time vary wildly, as they tend to do in high-stress situations. Time becomes elastic when the nervous system is flooded with adrenaline and fear. Some said it was only 30 seconds. Others insisted it must have been 5 minutes or more. But everyone agrees on when it ended. The creature turned away from the gathering, moving back into the darkness beyond the vehicles, and within moments, it had vanished completely. But the smell remained. For hours afterward, that rotting, sulfurous stench hung over the gathering site. People packed up quickly, far earlier than planned, eager to leave the area. But even as they drove away, many reported that the smell seemed to follow them. Sarah Yazzie described getting home, more than 20 miles away, and still smelling it, as if it had soaked into her clothes and hair. She showered immediately, washing her hair 3 times, but the smell persisted. Not as strong, but present, a faint echo of that overwhelming reek that made her stomach turn every time she caught a whiff of it. This lingering aspect of the smell appears consistently in skinwalker encounters across decades of reported sighting. The stench doesn't dissipate normally. It clings. It persists in ways that natural odors shouldn't. Marcus Benelli reported that the area where the gathering had been held smelled of decay for more than a week afterward. He returned 3 days later in daylight, curious and disturbed, wanting to see if there was any sign of what had visited them. The smell was still there, concentrated near the spot where the creature had paused by the pickup truck, strong enough that he could trace its rough path through the gathering by following the scent. He found no tracks, no scat, no shed fur, nothing physical that would indicate an animal had been present. Just that lingering smell of death and wrongness, slowly fading but refusing to disappear entirely. He spoke with a traditional practitioner, someone knowledgeable in the old ways, who advised him to perform a cleansing ceremony at the site. Even then, he was told, the taint might not fully leave. Some corruptions, the practitioner said, stain a place in ways that take a very long time to fade. The question that haunts researchers and witnesses alike is fundamental. Why does this death smell accompany these creatures so consistently? Witnesses across the Southwest, across decades, describe the same olfactory characteristics: decomposition, sulfur, wet animal, and an underlying wrongness that seems to trigger instinctive revulsion. The consistency of these descriptions, coming from people with no contact with each other, separated by years and hundreds of miles, suggests something real, something physical about the phenomena. One theory, rooted in traditional Navajo beliefs about skinwalkers, suggests the smell comes from the ritual of transformation itself. According to the lore, becoming a skinwalker requires acts of profound desecration. The killing of a close relative is often mentioned, along with the violation of sacred taboos and the handling of corpse powder, a substance made from the ground bones and flesh of the dead. If the transformation ritual involves such intimate contact with death and decay, perhaps the smell is simply the physical residue of these acts, soaked into the skin and hair of the practitioner, impossible to wash away because it's tied to the spiritual corruption of the transformation. But others suggest something more disturbing. What if the smell indicates a fundamental alteration in physiology? What if the transformation into a skinwalker isn't just a spiritual change, but a physical one, something that alters the body at a cellular level? Normal living tissue has a certain scent, maintained by healthy metabolic processes. But if those processes are corrupted, if the body exists in some state between living and dead, the smell of decay might not be residue from rituals, but the actual scent of the creature's altered flesh, tissue that's alive enough to move and hunt, but corrupted enough to register to human senses as fundamentally wrong, fundamentally dead. This would explain why the smell is so consistent, why it lingers so unnaturally, and why it triggers such profound fear responses. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to the smell of death, and for good evolutionary reasons. Throughout our history, the scent of decay signaled danger, disease, predators, contamination. Our ancestors who were most sensitive to that smell, who reacted most strongly to it, were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. The reaction isn't learned. It's hardwired, an ancient alarm system that operates below the level of conscious thought. When witnesses describe their reactions to the skinwalker smell, they consistently use language that suggests this deep, primal response. They don't just say it smells bad. They describe overwhelming nausea, immediate fear, and urgent need to flee. Parents grab children without conscious thought. Veterans trained in combat find their bodies responding as if under attack. These aren't the reactions to an unpleasant odor. These are survival responses, the nervous system recognizing a threat that the conscious mind might not even fully understand. James Sozi, the Marine veteran from the Window Rock encounter, spent considerable time trying to understand his own reaction that night. He'd maintained his composure under mortar fire, had performed his duties in situations where death was a constant presence. But the smell that preceded the creature at Window Rock affected him in ways that combat never had. It reached something deeper, he said, something that his training and discipline couldn't override. It was as if his body recognized something that his mind refused to fully accept, a predator designed to hunt human beings, carrying the smell of death as a warning that most prey would never have the chance to heed. The accounts continue to accumulate, year after year, adding to a body of testimony that's impossible to fully dismiss and equally impossible to fully verify. The smell arrives first, announces the presence of something wrong, and then lingers long after the encounter ends, as if to ensure that the witnesses never forget, never fully shake the certainty that something unnatural moved through their world, leaving nothing but the stench of corruption in its wake. The silence came first. That's what Patricia Sherman would tell investigators later, when the authorities finally arrived at their ranch in rural Montana on that October night in 2021. Not a sound, she said. Not the wind, not the insects, not even the familiar creak of the old barn settling on its foundation. The world didn't gradually grow quiet. It stopped, like someone had thrown a switch and cut the audio from reality itself. It was just past 8 in the evening when Patricia stepped onto the back porch to call in the dogs for the night. The air held that particular crispness that comes to the mountain valleys in autumn, when summer finally surrenders its grip and winter begins its patient approach. She expected to hear what she always heard at this hour: the distant lowing of cattle in the south pasture, the horses nickering to each other in the stables, the rhythmic chirping of crickets that had serenaded every evening of her 43 years on this land. Instead, she heard nothing. Absolute, total, devastating silence. At first, she thought something might be wrong with her ears. She turned her head, pressed a finger to one ear, and then the other, trying to pop them like you do after a flight. But it wasn't her ears. The silence was real, and it was everywhere. It pressed against her like a physical presence, like invisible hands covering her mouth and nose. She could hear her own heartbeat suddenly loud in her chest. could hear the blood rushing through her veins. These sounds seemed obscene in the stillness, too intimate, too human. Patricia called for the dogs. Her voice sounded flat, swallowed by the dark. The yellow porch light barely pushed back the shadows, gathering beneath the pines that ringed the property. Duke and Sadie, her 2 Australian shepherds, didn't come bounding up from the barn like they always did. She called again, louder this time, and heard the edge of worry creeping into her own voice. That's when she noticed the horses. The stable was about 50 yards from the house, a solid structure her grandfather had built in 1947 from timber he'd cut himself. Patricia could see it clearly from where she stood, illuminated by the security lights her husband Tom had installed 2 years prior. She could see the horses inside, all 6 of them, pressed against the back wall of their stalls. Their heads were high, ears pinned back, nostrils flared. And they were completely, utterly still. Horses don't stand still like that. Horses fidget. They shift their weight, swish their tails, toss their heads. They're animals of movement, of nervous energy, always ready to run. But these horses looked like statues carved from stone, and they were all staring in the same direction. East, dight, nay, toward the tree line. Patricia felt her stomach drop. She went back inside and found Tom in his office, going over feed orders on the computer. When she told him something was wrong, he looked at her with that expression he got when he thought she was overreacting. But he followed her outside anyway. He'd been married to her for 22 years. He knew when she was serious. Tom heard it too. Or rather, he heard the absence of it. The silence hit him like a slap. He stood on the porch beside his wife, his weathered face going pale in the yellow light. Then he grabbed the heavy mag light from beside the door and started toward the barn. Patricia followed, though every instinct screamed at her to go back inside, to lock the doors, to hide. Their boots crunched on the gravel drive, and those small sounds seemed thunderous in the stillness. Tom swept the flashlight beam across the property. The light caught the cattle in the near pasture, and what they saw stopped them both cold. 40 head of Angus cattle, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, were clustered against the far fence. Not grazing, not milling about. Clustered, pressed together like schooling fish fleeing a shark. And like the horses, they were all facing the same direction, all staring toward the darkened tree line where the pine forest began. The dogs were in the barn. Patricia found them behind a stack of hay bales, both of them pushed as far back into the corner as they could get. Duke, who'd once faced down a mountain lion without flinching, was trembling. Sadie had urinated where she stood, something Patricia had never seen her do. Their eyes were wide, whites showing, and when Patricia reached for them, Duke growled at her. Not a warning growl for her to back off, but a desperate, terrified sound that said, "Don't make me move. Don't make me leave this spot." She'd never heard a dog make a sound like that. Tom was checking the horses. His hands shook as he moved from stall to stall. The animals didn't acknowledge him. They couldn't. They were transfixed by whatever they sensed in the darkness beyond the fence line. Midnight, their black gelding, was breathing so hard his sides were heaving. Patches of sweat darkened his coat despite the cool evening air. Tom reached out to touch the horse's neck, and Midnight flinched but didn't look away from the trees. The silence continued. Minutes passed, then an hour. Tom called their neighbor, Frank Dietrich, whose property bordered theirs to the south. Frank answered on the first ring, his voice tight with fear. His animals were doing the same thing. Horses, cattle, dogs, even the chickens in the coop, all pressed against the far sides of their enclosures, all staring north, toward the Sherman property, toward the trees. Patricia and Tom went back to the house. Tom wanted to get his rifle. Patricia wanted to call the sheriff. They did both. Sheriff's department said they'd send someone when they could, but it was Saturday night and they had their hands full with the domestic disturbance in town. Tom loaded his .30-06 and stood by the living room window, staring out at the tree line. Their daughter Emma called at 9:30. She was away at college in Missoula, just checking in like she did most weekends. Patricia almost didn't answer. How do you tell your child that something is wrong, that something is terribly wrong, when you can't explain what it is? But she answered, and she kept her voice steady, and she told Emma everything was fine. After she hung up, she started to cry. Tom put his arm around her, but he didn't stop watching the trees. The silence lasted for 3 hours and 17 minutes total. Patricia would remember this precisely because she'd been staring at the clock on the microwave, watching the minutes change, praying for any sound, any indication that the world had returned to normal. When the silence finally broke, they almost wished it hadn't. The sound came from the forest, something moving through the underbrush, something large enough that they could hear it from inside the house, even with the windows closed. Not the crack of branches that you'd hear from a deer or elk, not the heavy, shambling movement of a bear. This was different, deliberate, purposeful, the sound of something that knew exactly where it was going and didn't care about being heard. It moved along the tree line from north to south, parallel to their property. Tom grabbed his rifle and ran to the south-facing window. Patricia followed with the cordless phone, her finger hovering over the redial button for the sheriff. They watched the darkness, trying to see what was making that sound, but the security lights only reached so far. Beyond their glow, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. The movement stopped directly east of the barn. Everything went silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. Waiting. Watching. Then came the smell. It rolled across the property like a wave, seeping through the walls of the house. Rotten musk and something else, something organic and wrong. Tom gagged. Patricia pressed her hand over her mouth and nose. The smell was thick enough to taste, coating the back of the throat, triggering an instant nausea that came from somewhere deeper than the stomach. It was the smell of death, but death that was still moving. Death that was still hungry. The cattle went insane. All at once they started bellowing. Not the normal sounds of distressed livestock, but screams. High-pitched, terror-filled shrieks that cattle aren't supposed to be able to make. Several tried to jump the fence. One succeeded, clearing the 4-foot barrier despite weighing over 1,200 pounds. It hit the ground running and didn't stop. Tom watched it disappear into the darkness heading west, away from whatever was in the trees. The horses were throwing themselves against their stall doors. Patricia could hear the wood splintering even from inside the house. Tom ran for the barn and she screamed at him not to go, but he went anyway. She followed because leaving him alone out there was worse than facing whatever was watching them. The barn was chaos. One of the stall doors had given way, and their mare Rosie was loose, rearing and striking at the air with her front hooves. Her eyes rolled back completely white, and foam flew from her mouth. Tom tried to calm her, but she nearly trampled him. Patricia grabbed him and pulled him back against the wall as the horse bolted past them, and out into the night. That's when they saw it. Or rather, they saw the absence of it. The trees at the edge of the property line were swaying. Something was moving between them, something tall enough to disturb the branches 15 feet up. The motion traveled smoothly from north to south, and in the shifting shadows between the pines, they caught glimpses of a shape that didn't resolve into anything their minds could categorize. Too tall to be a bear. Moving wrong to be human. There and not there, like trying to focus on something at the very edge of peripheral vision. Tom raised the rifle. His finger touched the trigger, but he didn't fire. Later, when the investigators asked him why, he couldn't explain it. Only that firing felt wrong, felt dangerous, felt like it would draw the attention of something that they desperately did not want looking at them directly. The shape moved south, following the tree line, and then it was gone. The movement stopped. The smell began to fade. And slowly, gradually, the normal sounds of night crept back into the world. Crickets first, tentative and quiet. Then a distant coyote. Then the wind rustling through the grass. The animals remained terrified for hours afterward. Duke and Sadie wouldn't leave the barn until sunrise. The horses that hadn't escaped stood in their stalls shaking, covered in sweat and bloody from where they'd injured themselves trying to break free. 3 of the cattle had heart attacks during the night. Tom found them dead in the pasture the next morning, their eyes wide and glassy, their mouths open in final silent screams. The sheriff's deputy arrived at 6:15 the next morning, over 9 hours after Tom's initial call. He took a statement, looked at the dead cattle, and wrote it up as a possible mountain lion sighting. He didn't have an explanation for why all the animals had reacted simultaneously, or why they'd all been staring at the same spot, or what had made that sound in the trees. Patricia and Tom sold the ranch 4 months later. They took a substantial loss, but neither of them could stay on that property. Not after seeing how the animals had reacted. Not after understanding that there are things in the dark that animals recognize instinctively, things that we've forgotten how to fear. Because that's what the silence means. When every creature falls quiet at once, when animals that normally see each other as predator and prey suddenly huddle together in shared terror, when even the insects stop singing, it means something has entered the territory that shouldn't exist. Something that every animal instinctively recognizes as an apex threat, so complete, so overwhelming, that their only response is to freeze and pray it passes by. The silence is the world holding its breath. The silence is nature itself acknowledging that something unnatural has arrived. And the silence, Patricia Sherman will tell you, is worse than any sound. Because the silence means it's already there, already watching, already deciding which one of you it wants. After all the accounts we've examined, after every testimony and warning sign cataloged, we arrive at the most unsettling truth of all. Despite centuries of encounters, despite generations of oral traditions and countless documented cases, we still don't understand what skinwalkers truly are. The Navajo themselves guard their knowledge closely, sharing only fragments with outsiders, perhaps because some understanding is too dangerous to spread. Or perhaps because even they don't have all the answers. The questions multiply the deeper we look. Why do they target specific individuals? Witnesses across decades have reported feeling singled out, chosen for reasons they can never comprehend. Some were simply driving through reservation lands. Others lived their entire lives in the shadow of these encounters. What criteria guides their selection? Is it opportunity or something more deliberate? The patterns suggest intelligence and intent, but toward what purpose remains entirely unknown. And what do they gain from the hunt beyond the kill? Because in many cases, they don't kill at all. They follow. They observe. What? They scratch at windows and circle properties for weeks or months before disappearing entirely. This suggests motivations that go beyond predation, beyond anything our understanding of natural behavior can explain. Fear itself may be the harvest, but we're left grasping at theories while the evidence points only to mysteries. Perhaps most disturbing is the mounting evidence that sightings are increasing beyond traditional Navajo lands. Reports from Wyoming, Montana, even as far as the Midwest describe encounters matching the classic sign. The territories are expanding, or perhaps what we call skinwalkers was never confined to one region at all. Something is changing. Whether it's their behavior or simply our awareness, the boundaries that once seemed to contain these entities are dissolving. Recognizing these signs doesn't guarantee your safety. It only means you're now aware of what's watching you. That scratching sound at 3 in the morning, the animal that moves wrong, the eyes that catch your headlights and don't look away. You'll notice them now. But notice this too. In many documented cases, people who recognized all 6 signs, who knew exactly what they were facing, were never seen again. They left only their testimonies, their warnings, their stories for others to find. And now you carry that knowledge too. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.